On behalf of the Center for Research in Vermont and also from our co-sponsor, the Chittenden County Historical Society. We have a full evening of looking at things, pictures and things, actual objects, and two speakers, teamwork here. Both of the ladies who are leading the discussion tonight are longtime educators, coming from different directions, but coming together in a cooperative project about which they'll be telling you this evening. Judy Dow has worked with both in schools and in a wider audience with interpreting Native American traditions and artifacts. She's done so in, as I say, in schools and also with two. She's associated with two organizations which are devoted to challenges which are now currently facing Native American communities. One of them is a California-based group, and another, which is local, Abenaki, a multi-generation endeavor to strengthen the cultural knowledge and identity of Eastern Native American peoples and to preserve our traditional homelands and sacred spaces. And for the honors and so on, I will simply boil it down to the fact that just last year she was named by the governor to the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs. Nancy Gallagher holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. She taught high school science and worked with curriculum innovation, and some of that innovation, I guess, led her to look past her net more broadly as she went on. The history of science and the growing role of biological research in public policy brought her to have an interest in research on the eugenics movement. And she has a very powerful and important book, Breeding Better Vermonters, the Eugenics Project in the Green Mountain State, published in 1999. She's content specialist and architect for the Vermont Eugenics web resource, which is under the UVM website, and she keeps herself out of trouble by calling herself an independent scholar, consultant, and lecturer. So, without further ado, I'll let these two ladies come up here and take over.
Good evening. We're delighted that so many of you could come and listen to what we have to share tonight. And I would first like to welcome you to the Center for Research on Vermont, our Research in Progress seminar. And I'd especially like to thank the Center for Research on Vermont on giving us the opportunity to share what's been a 2.5-year research journey together with you tonight. And I would also like to thank the Chittenden County Historical Society, who gave us some grant money in order to help purchase tapes and film, and to actually have hire someone to hire somebody to help us put a lot of our data on GIS, or Geographical Information Systems. That would be Charity Baker here, who has given us a tremendous amount of help.
And I'd like to thank some people also. There's archivists hidden all over this state in libraries and different collections, and they opened this whole new world to me. And I really want to thank them. Their love for the written paper and the written word has just been overwhelming to me, and it's been a great resource that I didn't know existed at the extent that it does. And it was there, it so easily fell into validating our oral stories, and I really want to thank them. I also want to thank the women in the Women's Circle who supported me through all of this. I had been told many times by many people to watch my back, to don't go there, to cut my hair, be careful about telling the story, you never know what's going to happen. And the women from the Women's Circle helped me get through all of that and supported every step. I also wanted to thank my husband, who doesn't have a clue of what I've been doing the last 3 years, but he has supported me anyways. And of course I want to thank my parents. Coming from a different period of time, they had a lot of patience in telling me story after story over and over again and interpreting the language from that period of time, which was indeed very, very different than today. And I want to thank Nancy for having a open heart and a clear mind for taking this journey with me.
Okay, three years ago I convinced myself that my work on the eugenics movement in Vermont was all but finished. I had done all I could do between the book and the website, and simply by providing those people interested in this sort of sad and dark chapter in our state's history, it provided somewhat of a common background for people who wanted to tell the other side of the story. What was it like to be on the receiving end of some of the attentions of state authorities during the eugenics era in the early 20th century? But I felt it needed to be told strictly from the perspective of those families, by the families themselves, in their own voice and in their own experience. I, as an academic outsider, was not the person to tell that story. And thanks to many people, some of who came tonight, over the last 12 years, I've been on a very long and interesting learning curve about the, some of it not so hidden, but some of it also sort of hidden and unstated, unwritten history of Native Americans living in the state. And it wasn't in September of 2004, that was nearly 3 years ago, Judy Dow called me with a question about the ethnic study of Burlington, which was done in the 1930s, especially the interviews of French Canadians that were posted on our website. She was preparing a lecture for the French Canadian Genealogical Society on finding your Indian ancestor, and wondered if I thought the French Canadians that the eugenics survey cast as French Indian and used such words like pirates and gypsies, if I felt they were really Abenaki or Abenaki. So we met for lunch and we not only had a lot in common, a lot of interest in uncovering the past, but that we had very large and very similar questions. Judy had a knowledge of Native American family tradition and culture. As well, she had a framework for actually articulating and telling the Abenaki story to somebody who was from a different culture, namely myself. My metaphor throughout my research was sort of like our memory, our history, our consciousness of the past, of who we are, is like a house surrounded by interlocking paths, and each represents certain social contexts and traditions which create what we understand to be real. Landmarks in the path are really past events, which are remembered and understood according to the path taken from the particular vantage point we see them. There are a lot of forgotten events. They are landmarks that are either off the beaten path or fall within traditions that have no social meaning for us. and events that mark the path, that are given prominence through their vividness and repetition, like holidays, like the Ethan Allen boys, like the Revolution, and like centennial, bicentennial events in this state. Their meaning is continually revised and integrated into the present. So for me, the eugenics survey in this past was sort of an intersection between two cultures where part of this is hidden. People have never heard of eugenics. In fact, many of you in this audience will say, what is she talking about? And I hope that as you listen, you will find out. And then there is also the problem of absence of Native American history from the usual histories that have been written traditionally in Vermont. Unfortunately, that's changing. So Judy asked me also, she said, have you ever heard of Moccasin Village? I said, Moccasin Village? I said, no, where's that? She said, well, it's on the north end of Burlington. So I asked around every historian I knew, Lillian Carlisle, people who had Burlington history, have you ever heard of Moccasin Village? And they said, no. So I said, this is one of those places. This is one of those intersections where, or those invisible barriers. So Judy is going to tell you where Moccasin Village is.
Moccasin Village, well, before I start, Nancy and I spent so much time in the early 1900s that frequently we'll use the street names from that period of time, but hopefully we can try to correct each other because I just noticed I have all the street names written from the 1900s. Moccasin Village is a little community that was built in the 1880s to house the second and third generation of French Indian people who chose to stay in Burlington and not travel from place to place, seasonal traveling. The first generation had already lived in the streets perpendicular to North Bend or Manhattan Drive, Spring Street, Cedar Streets in that area. And we refer to these people as French Indian for many reasons, and some of these reasons are going to come out in the journal entries and the stories that we tell you. And we're going to read throughout the evening different journal entries that we have written. And so I'm going to start with a little paragraph. Yesterday I took my father to the doctor's for a checkup. The nurse said, "Fuck that," in a heavy French accent. "Tu parles français, Monsieur Fotin?" "No, no, no," my father said. "I'm a galvanized Frenchman." "What's that?" the nurse asked. "I have a thin coating of French on the outside only," he told her. She chuckled and said, "Oh." They proceeded to talk about this one and that one that they both knew, while I sat there wondering, is this how the people of the square saw themselves? Galvanized Frenchmen. As persecuted as the French were in Vermont, it appeared that the French name provided a safer culture in which to hide than the Indian culture. So this is Moccasin Village, and the first one was also, and the name of the street today is Convent Square.
Yes.
Yeah. That's Crowley Street. Convent Square was the first one. That's right. It is. We get into that too. Good.
This is cut off a 1929 map that was in the city directory. I guess this doesn't come out clearly. The green in this diagram, these are ethnic neighborhoods that were, as they were researched in the 1930s, in the early 1930s. In the green, they were French. Can these lights be turned down a little bit or not? But French, that might help. The French area is all that part in green, and the dark blue is the German village. And then the purple down here is one of the Italian neighborhoods. But the French Canadian actually goes all the way down. And I think it's that bottom part of the diagram there, below Main Street and around Main and Battery, that was called Frenchtown at one time. Okay. The question is, were these French or were they Native Americans? Because they were portrayed as both. And so that question became the point of departure. That was one of our big questions. How do we answer that? How do we know? Okay, our process, here's a little diagram of it. What our process would involve is taking the oral traditional sources with which Judy was well acquainted, and the traditional historic things that are written down. The items on the right, maps, books, these are examples of sources we have used. And then we would also look at the oral tradition, or the nonverbal, the language, things that aren't written down, place names, trade routes, forms of expression, little customs and idioms, that sort of thing, and then lifestyles and values. Those things were, Judy can explain, are truly unique. And from putting together our knowledge on both these and looking at genealogy, as well as physical and cultural traits, we would hope to uncover the Native American or Abenaki history. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah.
Our process involved field trips, research days to various repositories, lots of discussion and dialogue on the phone, journal writing. And as we did this, we sort of had some rules that we made up for it, and here they are.
The first thing we decided was we were going to journal, and we were going to really spill our guts about everything and how we felt about what we found. Then we decided we were going to take the research we got and go in whatever direction it led us. We weren't going to look for a specific endpoint. We were going to give equal value to oral history and written history. And when we discovered barriers in our communication or interpretation, explore and recognize them as cultural ones that needed to be bridged. And many, many times, this was a source of frustration for both of us because we knew we were looking at the same thing. We had the same answer, but we were coming down different paths. So we duked it out till we met in the middle of the bridge.
and being educators, we realized that as close as we were, if we were having trouble educating each other, coming from, with the same, that this is probably a reflection of the larger culture we're in.
Right. And confidentiality was the other thing that was really important to us. There were many, many families that we have come in contact with that their family history has hidden this story to a point where the next generation did not have a clue of any of this stuff. And so to us it was very important to not share the names. So for instance, in this room tonight, many of those people are here and they may be related to other people that are here and they don't even know it. And the other thing we decided that we wouldn't do is we would never play Indian police. We would not be the person to say this one is Indian and that one is not.
Yeah, or this one is Abenaki and this is not. I like that word, Indian police, because that's not what we do. We're here to understand. Okay, one of my favorite parts, as I said, were field trips. And Judy and I took many. This is both a field trip, one of the places where we took a field trip, and it is also represents that place in 1927, I think.
This is a journal entry that I wrote after Kit Anderson brought her class to visit my house in 2004. Once a UVM ethnobotany class came to my home for a nature walk. We talked about actions and consequences in our world and how sometimes only a thread connects each ecosystem to one another. There was a quiet young woman in the class that day. She walked with us and listened intensely, not saying too much. We came in the house after a while to have a snack and look at baskets. I spoke of the connections with the land and the animals and how that was so much a part of life. The young woman began to cry. I had a sad feeling come over me. I stopped and asked her what was wrong. She said, "You made me see so many things. You made so many things clear for me today. I never understood why my family was different or why the land and the animals were so much a part of my life. hunting and fishing is such a big part of my family's life," she continued. I said, "What is your name?" I couldn't believe what she was saying. It was a French name I knew from the avenue. Her uncle had married my cousin, and I had gone to school with her father. She had confirmed some things for me, and I helped expand her worldview. It was apparent to me that this was the beginning of how she fit into the bigger picture of Vermont history, a scene I've seen played out over and over again.
One thing that was an epiphany for me in our many discussions of cultural differences and what we call cultural markers, one thing that really stood out is when Judy once remarked to me, she said, "I hate that word landscape. It's not a landscape, it's the land." And me, I love landscapes. I like to draw landscapes. I have pictures of them. I photograph them. Our house has a nice framed view of the mountain. My culture, we love our views. And I come from sort of a Yankee Protestant culture, I guess you'd say. And on my walls and everything, and then I thought, this love of landscape, was I exhibiting one of my own cultural markers? We see it in names of conferences and names of books. We see it a lot when we describe Vermont as a landscape. So this warranted some explanation. And then I realized that landscape really means a picture of natural inland scenery, a branch of painting, or an expanse of natural scenery that's seen by the eye in one view. That's very visual. That's not how Judy looks at this picture. She sees something else, and this is taken of the interview. She has a whole different thing she'll share, what she sees.
We had to invent new words and phrases to explain much of what we saw on this journey. Cultural markers, cultural amnesia, just a few. One term that was a big part of her story was created by Dr. Lisa Brooks. Lisa is here today. You want to stand? A term she had created to tell her story. Her book will be out in print soon, and it's one I recommend you read. It's called The Common Pot, Indigenous Writing and the Reconstruction of Native Space in the Northeast. We borrowed her term, the common pot, because it best explained our story, and we were very thankful that Lisa came up with the term. To me, the common pot is the place that offers food for everyone. It's the place that the animals frequent for their food and consequently add to the food source for people. It's the place where you cannot only get food but hides for clothing and plants for material culture like baskets and mats and games. It's Hannaford's Toys R Us and Hill's Hardware Store all woven into one. It's the place where you can call home, and it's the place we call today the Intervale.
For me, I call this the historian's dilemma. It should be Vermont historian's dilemma, because I think Sam Hand first wrote about this in 1982 in A Place of Nature. We, for nearly 200 years, have been reading the same history over and over again, and when people say, look at Vermont history, they say, no, the Abenakis left a long time ago. They're not there. And so these are two maps. I had to go back and look at colonial history, and think about what was it like from the Abenaki point of view when my ancestors came. These are two maps out of the same book. On page 25, you see the one on the left. There are the Western Abenaki. There's Missisquoi, Kawasaki, Cusack, and so forth. They're there. And then by page 225, I guess it is, they're gone. Yeah. See, they disappeared. Those little red dots represent Indian trails and villages. Okay, and look, northern Maine, it somehow got erased out of the picture. Right. Okay, now he does make a point. He said this is 17th and 18th century New England Indian trails and villages, but it says in Maine the trails consist of a vast network of interconnected rivers and lakes. And at the time of contact, Vermont had Indian trails, but only a handful of settlements at its border. Oh, okay. This map came out of, it was a composite of Colin Calloway's work, and it was from Vermont Myths and Realities. And I colored in the dots that were main Indian settlements after contact. And you see one in Burlington, the Siscoy, down at the junction of the Hoosick River, and then some along the Connecticut River. And looking back, at this relationship, and we're starting to go, in our talk, we're going to be looking at one of the themes. What were the various challenges to Abenaki people in Vermont from the time of contact? And we actually trace that on sort of a timeline. That timeline is not a complete thing. It kind of goes with our talk. So these are the major things, and I needed to see a map of the rivers. This is out of that book, White Devil. There is this actual map of Robert Walker's expedition to St. Francis in 1759 has surfaced in a local collector. It was found, I guess. It had gone back to England. And if you look, there are all the rivers and streams. There's the homeland. Look at the watersheds. I think one has to look at the watersheds when they think about where Abenaki people live. And you see the French missions, but at this time there's only a few forts down at the bottom of the state. And this is my favorite map, which I colored in. In 1759, 1760, at the end of what they call the French-Indian War, or what my ancestors called the French-Indian War, this is a map that was drawn, and as you see, there's no borders around Vermont. I think it's very interesting because they say that there might be a way up to Lake Nymphomagog up there. But the thing that really, to me, it's the mindset of the English colonists at the end of the war as they lusted after the land that they had won from the French and the Abenaki. Notice it says right up in the Moccasin Intervales, good white pines and good land, choice white pines and good land. And then they cut a road along what was the old, what they claimed was where the captives had taken, their prisoners up to the Siscoy and up to Montreal. And as you see, one of that, the French River, that's later the Onion River, now the Winooski River. That was one of the trails. And this map is probably drawn from, shortly after this point. In the new book by Michael Sherman, Gene Sessions, and Jeffrey Potash, Freedom and Unity, they said in 1760, the New England soldiers saw an inviting land cleared at last of French and Indian menaces. When the Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed the French loss of Canada, the Vermont forest already echoed to the clank of the surveyor's chain and the ring of the settler's axes. Now, one of my Vermont ancestors was pretty much to the point because he did fight in this war and he fought later in the Revolution and he wrote a lot of poetry. His name was Thomas Rowley. So it's kind of interesting to go back in my own family history and read some of this stuff that my ancestors wrote. And he was trying to get New Yorkers to come over and settle in Rutland at the time, and this is what he wrote in one of his poems. This is the noble land by conquest won, took from a savage band with sword and gun. We drove them to the west, they could not stand the test. And from the Gallic pest, this land is free. Here churches will erect, both neat and fine, the gospel will protect, pure and divine, the Pope's supremacy we utterly deny, and Lewis we defy, we are George's men. So, I mean, that was before the Revolution, because later he fought in the Revolution with the Green Mountain Boys and was one of the people that helped form the new government. He wasn't George's men then, he fought against them. But here's the beginning, right out of their mouths, of the anti-Indian, particularly anti-Abenaki sentiment and the anti-French sentiment that I see through texts all the way for the next 200 years. Okay, within a generation or two, the Abenaki territory had been surveyed, parceled out, subdivided, deeded, and sold to New England immigrants. Abenaki family bands that remained in their homeland were now subject to local, state, and U.S. federal laws. And there's this 1794, unfortunately with this lighting, you can't see the division. By 1814, look, it's all chopped up, that piece. And I'm convinced that a lot of the, what was Abenaki territory, the Canadian border comes across, then these other state borders, and then what happens in early statehood, we have all these little town jurisdictions, and people, Abenaki who remained, had now a whole new adjustment to make. And then there were only a few thousand people in 1760, and they were all down near Fort Donner and Fort Number 4. They were down in that southeast corner of the state. By 1791, there were over 85,000 settlers from New England. There was a huge population swarm coming out of lower New England. By 1800, there were over 154,000. So that was a huge immigration settling on this land. So that's our next thing. What happened to the Abenaki?
Remember those terms I told you about that we had to invent? Well, one of them that we came up with was cultural amnesia. It's when something is around for so long, others adapt it and takes it as something that belongs to their culture and totally forgets where it originated. Take, for instance, Indian Rock and Indian Rock Farm. Some of you may know where Indian Rock is, but many of you probably don't. You see, Indian Rock was a lookout rock on the north end of Burlington. When you climb to the top, you can see as far north as Canada, as far south as Shelburne. A great place to be when you're looking for a friend or foe. For those of you that don't know where Indian Rock is, it currently has Ethan Allen Tower built on top of it. And of course, Indian Rock Farm was the original name Ethan Allen had given to his farm. Something else that you might not know is that my family was the last family to farm this farm, and many of the farms along the perimeter of the Intervale and on Intervale Road. Here's a journal entry. August 2nd, 2005. It's those damn boundaries and European names that have misdirected history and caused the original territories to be lost in time. Indian people do not put land or people into neat little boundaries or classify jobs, lifestyles, and material culture into categories. The settlers that came from Europe did that. And since they recorded most of the history, the villages of Winooski and Missisquoi and others were given boundaries and placed into categories. I guess because the Europeans saw it easier to learn about this land if it was categorized. The land as the written language was not explained to them. Had it been, history would have recorded many things differently.
What happened to our life? Did you do the economic plan? Oh. Professor Rogers is figuring this out. Go ahead.
Well, this is a sign in front of Ethan Allen Park, and I just wrote one little sentence that kind of says a lot to me. Indian presence is always subordinate to European presence. Unless there is money to be made. No money, it becomes an afterthought. And if you look at the sign, you can see the afterthought is the very end about Indian Rock.
Okay, what started to happen in after the Civil War, really, we are kind of going ahead in time, this is the beginning of archaeology. And this picture is in my book. What you see here, this is another intersection between Judy's ancestors and Vermonters, if you want to, or Vermont Yankees, I guess. I don't know what they would be called, European Americans. And this is a picture of George Henry Perkins, who is on the far right there. his wife, and the little boy in front is Henry Perkins. He will figure into our story later on. George H. Perkins, who the geology building is named after, was a UVM professor of natural sciences here, state geologist at UVM. And he had reported in 1873 a pre-Columbian cemetery, as he called it, of 25 to 30 graves excavated by local collectors in Swanton. Now, one of those local collectors is there with Perkins, and this probably had to be, you know, in the neighborhood of the early 1880s, from the age of little boy in front. And Leslie Trax he was considered the father of amateur collectors. He gathered over 4,000 Indian remains and artifacts from the Champlain Valley, many of which ended up in the museum anthropology department. So they were, as Abenaki people see this, diggers and looters. And Trax was one of the big amateur ones. And they went on as amateur archaeologists and went all around the Lake Champlain, surveyed the borders of Lake Champlain to find more. But for Judy and I, these archaeology reports actually provided a whole different purpose to help document Native history.
And we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Doug Frink and Charity have helped us with understanding many of the archaeological terms. But if you noticed, these dots represent known Native American sites, and they seem to cluster around the streams around the Winooski River.
Yeah, they define the watersheds. If you can find the Winooski River, that definitely, you can think of it as a common plot for many, many generations. Also, the field trips, Judy was excellent at pointing out everything from little minnow tracks to what was blooming at a certain time to things like this. And she'll explain, this was one of our winter forays.
One of the things that Nancy and I discovered was how interdisciplinary this journey was. The plants and water brought the animals and water roots brought the people, and the people made the settlement. So much was interconnected. Walking this land, we often saw trails embedded deeply into the ground. The field trips and hikes we took told the history clearly. It was important to go back to the same spots often. The different seasons told us different stories. The winter snow magnified the depth of the trail. And you can see how many people have walked that trail. It's along Muddy Brook, where Muddy Brook joins the Winooski.
Yeah, it's really deep. Okay, another change. Very early, we've looked at laws a lot, tried to understand how various legal changes may have affected indigenous people living in particular parts of the U.S. or Canada. And hunting and fishing laws, the early 19th century. One thing I noticed is when people were arrested, because I worked a lot in areas where they were noting all these criminals, some of the families that had these so-called criminal element in them, they were arrested for illegal hunting and fishing. And that's a recurring theme in the eugenics thing, it's illegal hunting and fishing. Now, if you go back and look at the hunting and fishing laws, they start to close in on where you can hunt, seasons, permits, and this really starts almost at statehood in certain parts of the state, and then it evolves into our fishing game treatments today. So do you want to, this happens to be a picture I pulled off the landscape program website, which on the handout, it's how you get to that. There's thousands of old photos. The students went to a tremendous amount of work, and this is 1890. It's in the Burlington section. Although the question is, where is it? 1890, a fisherman repairing his nets. And that's where another thing, what you could use and what you couldn't use was changed too. So do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Another journal entry. November 8, 2004. Dad had drawn us a detailed map of every house on Commerce Square in Washington Street. Moccasin Village. His memory was awesome. He listed the surnames of the people living in each house and all of their children. We took this map and drove down North Bend or Manhattan Drive and headed towards the Moccasin Village. Nancy and I were full of questions. I'm sure we taxed the memory of this 85-year-old man to the max. So, Dad, I've heard that North Bend was a French Indian community. He looked at me as if I had two heads and said, why, sure, everyone knows that. North Bend is on the edge of the Intervale. Did they hunt there? Did they hunt there? Yep. What did they hunt? Muskrats in April, he said. Dad, tell me about the hunting. Most of the people on the square hunted, he said. They needed the food. Where did they hunt? We did most of the hunting around Woodlawn, Woodbury, and Stanberry roads up where they are today. There were some woods and open fields there. We hunted for partridge, pheasants, squirrels, and rabbits, sometimes a deer. Not too many deer there. We hunted in the Intervale for muskrats. There were lots of muskrats there. Game was a big thing back then. That's how you got your food. Fishing too, he said. Pike season in the spring was so busy. The pike went upriver to spawn, and the boats were so close together they were touching each other. Spring fishing was done mostly from the shores for us, except for walleye. That was trolling. You needed a good two-ended boat like my Uncle Joe used to make. When you did night fishing for bullpout, you would set a line with a stick and a bell, and when the bell rung, you knew you had a bullpout on the end of the line.
When we went down to what they call the mouth of the river, it's north end extension, and some of you, I think, maybe from there that are here tonight. In the fall of 2004, the first thing, we were talking to some of the residents, and they were really kind of upset about how they had changed all the laws. You can't do this anymore. You can't snowmobile. It's all, parkland and so forth. So when we went here, I noticed this sign, and that was after getting the earful about all the new restrictions on traditional hunting and fishing practices. So we began photographing some signs, and they're not allowed to on those premises where her father used to hunt muskrat. That's the end of that right now. And so, you want to go on to the photography?
Sure.
Okay.
September 6, 2005. Yesterday I had one of those aha moments. Actually, it was 3 hours of treasured moments. I spent the summer zooming around town taking pictures of everything I saw, documenting my stories with pictures. Finally, I put them together into several photo albums and brought them over to share with my parents. My father recognized many of the pictures of the land, like he had been there yesterday. His comments were funny at first. After time, they took on a new meaning to me. Over and over again, he commented on the undergrowth and thickness of the vegetation. The vegetation along roadsides, riverbanks, lake shores, and so on struck him odd. I didn't even realize that he was repeatedly saying this until he said, quote, "This wouldn't look like this if Jake were there. Jake would have burned all this undergrowth out of there. You can't hunt or fish when everything looks like this," he said. And Jake was a friend of his that was from Moccasin Village, and we interviewed both Jake and my father about this story, and they both told the same story about burning the Intervale every year. So I went through the newspaper clippings and the fire department records, and apparently they burned it up until 1940, and each year it was recorded as mischievous boys playing in the Intervale.
Read some of the old New England history. One of the ways they kept the undergrowth out of forests was through burning. So I found it really fascinating that Judy's father and uncle burned the Intervale when they were teenagers for muskrat hunting.
This salmon hole, I think you'll probably know where that is, right where the Winooski comes around the corner from Winooski. And it was traditionally a place where people would gather year after year after year and fish for salmon. And it was an annual spring event. And here's a journal entry that kind of describes my feeling when we went on this field trip. It's the modern written signs that are now confusing to me. As you enter the path to Salmon Hole, several very large signs state the following: closed to fishing, March 16th to June 1st inclusive, spawning waters. Interesting, isn't it? Something that's been done since the beginning of time now has to change. I wonder, is it the dams upstream that have limited the number of fish? Maybe it's the constant leaks and spills from factories and sewage plants. like the one that happened on July 2005 when Cabot Creamery accidentally discharged enough ammonia to kill an estimated 15,000 fish in the Winooski River. It just so happens that Cabot Creamery is at the headwaters of the Winooski. I wonder, where did all the fish go? Yep, those signs can be confusing. They tell you something, but they really don't say anything.
On our one of our field trips in November in 2004, we explored this old workhouse. I guess I didn't know it was called the Abear Farm, but or the Abear House. It was once owned in the early 19th century by Pomeroys, and this is where the strolling poor were sent. And we took a lot of pictures of this house. I could imagine this was one of the places where they could work off their debts. And the strolling poor were those people who were sort of moving from place to place. They had different names at different times. So we wanted to be more.
Yeah, there's quite a story around this house, actually. Pomeroy the father was a doctor, and Pomeroy the son was a lawyer, and coincidentally also the overseer of the poor. And the father was upset with these strolling poor not paying off their debts. So he turned their name over to the son, who consequently had these people go work at the workhouse and work off their debts to his father, the doctor, who also owned the house. So it was quite a little circle there going on. And I guess that was probably the politics of the early 1800s. But in the middle of the politics were these Abenaki people, these strolling poor, who had not settled to one place. They were still moving from place to place and coming back to family lands.
Also, where is this? This is right on Intervale Road, going down, like, you know, where the compost is. Okay.
I mean, I keep asking where it is, but I think
We should
material is so intimately, you know, your knowledge is so intimate of this that you just say the Abear house.
Right.
Please, when you go, maybe you could just tell us where it is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's not there today.
You'll see.
It was there.
The rest of the story is coming. Another thing about poor laws that I studied some in the course of my work is the early part of statehood, they had warnings out. They were using the old settlement laws from England and New England, that the town had to take care of any poor that lived there. It was up to the town. You know, there was no other aid. And so if somebody came in, a family came through and wanted to stay there for a while, they could issue them a warning out, so that saying, you know, you have to get out of here. We're not going to take care of you if you can't make it on your own. And so there's someone published. I'm sorry, I have to look in my bibliography of Breeding Better Vermonters, but they did publish all the warnings out in Vermont that they could find. And so we've been looking, and there are some familiar names there. There are some people passing through Burlington that got warned out of some of these communities that do end up later. And we also ended up looking at, or this was all Judy doing one summer. She went back and looked at the Burlington poor records here.
And what
we put this on.
Yeah, what I found was in the poor records of 1881 to 1883, there were 13 children sent to Virgins, and there are only 12 dots there because I couldn't find the address on the 13th one. But various students have helped us throughout this project, and Julia back here, Harvard graduate, has been working with us on this. We went down to Vital Statistics, we looked up the birth certificates of all of these students, found out their parents, came back to Special Collections and did the city directories and got their addresses. So there's quite a bit of research to these 12 little dots. But as you can see, those 12 little dots follow the intervale for the most part in the water. It's because they all fall into those French Indian communities that we showed on one of our very first maps.
Why did the children get sent to Virgins to do what?
Truancy. They were picked up for truancy if they did not attend school. But another thing that starts to happen in this period is mandatory education, law saying you have to go to school. Okay. Here's what happened. We were kind of chagrined to discover that this is what happened to this little building. And this is what's left of that Abear workhouse, the Abear Farm workhouse on the Intervale. It got torn down last summer. And that was, after you've been doing this research, it kind of was sad thinking of all those people that lived there. Go on. But, go ahead. Graveyard is also fine. There's a lot of clues to the...
Yeah. This is a spot where priests came down from Montreal very early on, before there was a church there, and they gave masses for the French Indian people that were living there. And when we first made that connection with the workhouse on Intervale Road, we wondered, where did the people who died go? So we met with the cemetery commissioners, and we started tracking down the pauper cemetery for that area. And there, it's, you know, up on Archibald Street there, the St. Joseph's and Mount Calvary, the two. Well, Mount Calvary is where the French people were, and the Irish are on the other side. Even in death, they don't cross. But anyways, there's a paupers area, and there are a few metal stakes like this, crosses marking where the people were buried. And if you go to the next one. And what's happened in recent times is that family members have this memory of their loved ones being buried in this pauper grave, and they're starting to bring stones there. And people are collectively buried in one area, and the cemetery commissioner is not sure where, so he's been placing the stones around the perimeter to mark where the graves could be. They could be in this pauper section. And it's kind of interesting to me that the connections are still there in the places of these, in the minds of these people, and that these people are still remembered and not forgotten.
One of the most difficult things that Judy and I, or one of the challenges we had, is in what's in a name. Because I was used to seeing names, all these people, and Judy would say, those are French Canadian, those are French names, those are French families, those are Abenaki families. And I'd say, well, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and half of these names are in my yearbook. You know, I play the devil's advocate all year. Tell me what I need to know in order to understand about names. And Judy has been studying genealogy and names for years. And genealogy is one of those things that I glaze over, even my own. I say, there are all these people. Tell me a story or introduce me to them in some way, and maybe I'll remember them. So Judy was really essential in educating me about family names and kinship relationships and how they fit together in Burlington, the Intervale area. So here, go ahead and tell how.
This was one of those bridges we had to meet in the middle, because it was frustrating for me too that like all through college, every paper I had turned in, people would say, what's the source? What's the source? List the source. And I'm like, damn, I'm the source. I know that. It's common knowledge, you know? And I couldn't understand, and Nancy's probing, you know, to prove it to her, motivated me many, many times. And the cemetery became the place to prove it to her. Many stones you'll see 3 names of the same family going around in a circle. In this one you can see Chiquin, C-H-I-C-O-I-N-E, and Chiquin anglicized, S-H-E-Q-U-E-N. And side by side were brothers and sisters and relatives with variations or anglicized names of the same French variation. And we did most of the 25 genealogy on 25 families in Moccasin Village. And many of those families we could trace back, I think it was 15 of them, to Pecumtuck, Chattahoochee, Odanak family names of the 25. So there was not only that French connection, but then you had to take that French connection and go back to the Abenaki connection. So like Nancy said, genealogy was critical to this.
The bulk of our work has actually been in the 20th century, so if we're very short of time, we're going to, you'll have to hear us, or wait till we publish something, or do another presentation. But most of my work has been in the 20th century history of biology, medicine, and social work. And these are some of the challenges, new challenges that families who were not an integral part of the New England Euro culture had, and that was mandatory schooling, IQ testing, and mental testing was started then. There was a whole bunch of social welfare laws that came along that I'm going to outline very quickly. And there was an expansion and a centralization of state authority over all of these sorts of health, education, welfare concerns. And so we are going to give you some snapshots in some of the work we have done, a few stories, some maps, and this was the first one. We looked at the story was great. Judy was looking for Indian rock, and she went on the web. She was looking at Burlington WPA material, and lo and behold, she says, "Hey, they have all the Burlington school records and special collections." So I said, "Hey, that's cool." So I went home and told my husband, who was director of special collections. He said, "I know. I picked them all up." So we said, "Well, let's see what we can find here." This is what, exploring the documents. And Judy found all the truant officers' reports, which are a rich kind of cultural history, insight into this period, and any kid can relate to the issue of going fishing instead of school, or the whole issue of fear of truant officers, and worse. So she'll tell you a story about the truant officers.
November 17th, 2004. Dad, tell me some of the stories about St. Joseph's School. Well, I didn't go there too long. Only a couple of years, he said. Don't you remember me telling you why? I couldn't remember what I had for dinner last night. How was I going to remember why you stopped going to school in 3rd grade? No, I don't remember, Dad. I said, boy, I tell you these stories so you remember the tough times, he said. Okay, so Dad, remind me again. Well, it was tough going there because they were so mean to the people that were poor. And I had enough, and I decided not to go to school anymore. What did you do? I asked. I ran away. To where? To my sister's place. I hid out there for 30 days. I couldn't last more than 30 days. Why? I asked. Well, the truant officer came after me and told my sister that every day I didn't go to school, she was to give me a spoonful of castor oil. I lasted 30 days. Not too bad for a 9-year-old, he proudly said. Well, my mother found out and took me back to school. She was mad when she found out about all the crap they were pulling on us kids, so she took me to another school. Lawrence Barnes, he said. But I was behind by now because at St. Joseph, if you were poor, they didn't care if you learned. Plus, I missed 30 days of school, so I had to go back a grade. I recall the story of my father's Aunt Victorine. She too had run away from school, and she too had had the truant officer after her. But at the age of 13, she married him, and then she no longer had to go back to school. I find this rebellion to authority figures interesting. I've heard so many stories throughout my life of constant rebellion. Once again, I wonder, was this a cultural marker? I was sure it was, because many times I had seen this behavior in myself. I hated that life wasn't fair. I hated that the poor or the different guy was always the one that got the shaft.
And these were, if you were truant, these were the kids that were actually sent to reform school in those years, that were sent to the reform school for being truant. And look at the neighborhoods. Are we seeing the pattern here? And here's a picture of that neighborhood. The wonderful thing about Judy's father is we would bring these records, and he would explain them, whether they were court records or truant officer records or even photographs like this. He would have lots of stories to tell about this place. And so I just can't thank him enough for everything that he taught us. So this is on. Tell where it is. It's on North Bend, or I guess you call it Manhattan Drive now?
North Bend, yeah. Not Manhattan Drive, right.
Right on the edge of the Intervale.
I had looked in the truant officer's report for my father's name, remembering the stories he had told me, but this time frame was too early for him. I did find many of his cousins, though. I asked him about the truant officers. He told me Mr. Hicks was the guy after us when I went to school. He knew just where to find us. Why, I asked him. I don't know, Dad said. He just did. Dad, I remember when reading that they often found kids on the railroad tracks. Why, way down there? Well, when the train came into the city, they dumped their old bed of coals along the tracks. When they were leaving the city, and the kids would go down there and pick them up and bring them home to burn. Why did they drop them off in the Intervale, I asked. Well, you don't dump them in the city. They thought this was the best place, I guess. It was perfect for us. We'd just come down over the bank and pick them up. I could see why the truant officer knew just where to find them. You see, Mr. Bray, the truant officer of this time frame, lived in the very neighborhood of the students. He lived on Park Street.
We just do the family for. Okay, around 1915, we start getting some very serious legislation. And one is the Child Welfare Law of 1915. And it defines, for the first time, what a delinquent and a dependent child is. And we've got legal definition now. And if you look at this, this is who they are. They break a law, they're incorrigible or persistently truant from school, or you associate with bad people, it's who you associate with, or if you are growing up in idleness and crime, they're things that today we would say, what is this? This was backed by legal authority agreements, and this was the era in these years up into the 20s of child rescues, where they pull kids out, place them in foster care, or up for adoption, or put them in state institutions. It was also 1915, the Brandon School for feeble-minded persons was established, and a colony at Rutland for so-called feeble-minded women of childbearing age. And feeble-mindedness is a term that really has no meaning for us anymore, but it certainly did for these people. In 1919, the Vermont Children's Aid was established, and again, that was to provide for dependent and neglected children, support wholesome family groups, and they really wanted Mother's Aid. They wanted some really good things that weren't available before that. But they also wanted children out of families they felt were immoral, indecent, or were endangering them in some way. And so, you see the little car, they'd go to collect the children. The parents could get cited for neglect and sent to prison or non-support. If there were a man and woman living together that weren't married but had a family, they would be cited for adultery or cohabitation, and their children were taken away. And this, I feel, was one of the major assaults on some of the families that we have known that were French Abenaki. The first person, the first agent in the Southern District was a woman named Harriet Abbott, and she will figure in very prominently in the next 10 years in identifying families that they're singling out for not having children anymore. And she started publishing these true stories of Vermont children. She tells how she got these children out of the family and sent their mother off to the colony for the feeble-minded. And this picture of this girl, this was in that first annual report in 1920. The maiden of today is the mother and home builder of tomorrow. The treatment she receives today means weal and woe for day to come. This is a mindset of the social workers and a lot of people at that time. And there are the girls in Virgins and the reform school learning to can, and the boys are planting beans and that sort of thing. And for some children, they were desperately poor, and probably this was the first square meal they had. Okay, along comes something called eugenics, which is a large, it's a teaching journey. It's a philosophy that's grounded in human heredity, human genetics. And eugenics means well-born. And what happened during the probably late 1880s up through the 1940s, and I think to the present, but not everyone agrees with me, is that people believe that the science of genetics and human heredity should be used in order to kind of weed out the weak and promote more childbearing among what they called desirable people. They were desirable and undesirable. And so here comes the third D in the 3D families that the eugenicists talk about: dependent, delinquent, defective. The term genetic defect emerges in the eugenic movement as genes that cause behaviors that are unsocial, that cause addiction to alcohol, for example, and this has not gone away. Okay, that intelligence, they figured intelligence or developmental delay was caused by one gene, a recessive gene, and that made you unable to learn after a certain age. And these were also the men that invented IQ tests. They also wanted to measure this so we could see who should be in an institution for the rest of their lives or be sterilized and not be married. So here, this picture is right out of the eugenics survey files on eugenics education. It's a little drawing, and this is the mindset. Child, good heredity, high mentality, poor heritage, low mentality, and he ends up in jail. And that's largely because of the laws that we've had. Okay, in 1925, along comes Professor Henry Perkins. Remember the little boy in the camping out with his father who was digging up Indian remains? Well, he was the first. He went on to school. He got his PhD at Johns Hopkins, and he became a professor and actually the chair of the zoology department at UVM. And there's Science Hall, and he started something called a eugenics survey, where they would do studies of genealogies of the families that they felt, and try to track. You've seen these sort of pedigree charts in genetics books. You know, what they do is they try to trace down the F gene for feeble-mindedness, or they try to find everyone who had ended up in an institution or received charity in his family, and he called them our pedigrees of degenerate families in Vermont. Okay, and very quickly, in a nutshell, this is sort of a very abbreviated version of what they did. And it was actually these social workers were doing this beforehand. In 2 or 3 years before Perkins caught on to this, social workers at the Vermont Industrial School and the Children's Aid were already starting to build these charts of their family trees of their clients. And what they did in a eugenics chart, they do 3 things. They do the genealogy, they attribute characteristics they see to heredity, like the F gene, the feeble-mindedness gene, or whatever. And then they figure out how much they cost the taxpayers during the year. There's always an economic component to all of these studies. Okay. By the way, a lot of these are on our website if you're interested. They had kind of threefold mission. They did the research. They did a lot of public education. They put out annual reports, which if you want to read are in special collections at UVM. They had a lot of newspaper articles in this period. And you will see this was not just Vermont. This was an international phenomenon, and definitely in most states in this country. Vermont did not have the most aggressive eugenics. And the other thing, they had a political action agenda. And the eugenic piece of that was either through putting people in institutions or sterilizing them, sexually sterilizing them. That would be, that would supposedly improve the human population or the human race. Now, England, where this all started, they never did sterilize people. They just kept them in institutions all their life if they felt they shouldn't have children. Okay, and this is also where you start seeing agitation for, and this is 1927, for mandatory IQ tests. And the IQ tests they were using them have all been discredited today. If you looked at some of the ways they calculated IQ, it's sort of like no Jeopardy for 1920. You know, they were questions that were cultural questions, and that is a whole very fascinating subject in itself, mental testing. And they wanted to send people around the state and early intervention, get them when they're young, find out if they're mentally retarded, and then we'll know what to do.
That's not a swastika. It's an indigenous sign from people, indigenous people around the world used to show the natural order that things happen in the world. And Hitler reversed the legs, and that became the swastika.
Yeah, you see it in a lot of, it was a popular sign used back in the 20s. And that's probably why the Nazis picked it up, reversed it, twisted it. And I think it's also seen in old Aryans.
Yeah, I think very old.
Yeah, you see
cultural
those.
groups.
Does anyone have a better explanation here? No. Okay. Here, this is just a little tracing. One of the things that we learned, we went back and really looked at distance, which I didn't do initially when the family studies of the Eugenics Survey. And part of the reason is I didn't feel I should be looking into people's family life. I had a little bit of inhibition. I had to look at certain things that were there, but I realized this was somebody's family. This is somebody's life. And I was pretty much warned off some of it. But for Judy to look at her family in there, that's different. For somebody who that's their family in there, I think they have every right to go look and to study it and to try to understand it. And so one of the things we discovered in going through this, not only with Judy's assistance with names and understanding kinship relationships, is we found that really all their studies kind of started with Burlington and Chittenden County, because, I mean, it makes sense, that's where they were. There is some exceptions to that. There are some that were already had kids in institutions, and I know that's where they started mining the social department, public welfare's records, and the state institutional records. And then, but these families weren't here. They were in Colchester. They were down the road in Burlington, Montana. So they could very quickly get their vital records and do their family history. As in one of, oh, I'm sorry. For example, one family that they were trying to get research on, Charles Barber, who was chief of police in Winooski at the time, he says that tracing that family, the pedigree of that family in Vermont is no less difficult than would be tracing the pedigree of the frogs on the Lamoille River. And that's one of Judy's family groups. Okay, so I see we're kind of going over on time, so I'm going to kind of go through my part a little faster. And a lot of this part in the eugenics I've written about in my book, so, and there's a lot out on it. There was a group of people, there was one kinship network they nicknamed pirates, but they were really French, Indian, or French and Indian, and Abenaki families. And I understand some of those people, English was not their first language, Abenaki and French were. And they used to live in houseboats. These are a picture of houseboats on the Burlington Harbor, and I guess, you know, the city officials would just assume they were cleaned up and moved out. But if you trace where the Eugenics Survey traced that family, there they are. They're all around. These are the places where the Eugenics Survey traced them down, all around the lake, this kinship network. And here are all the archaeological sites. Some of these sites are right where these families live. And they were French Indian, definitely French Indian or Indian French. That's what the Eugenics Survey called them. So we find that this is circumstantial evidence, but we find with the oral tradition and the oral histories of this, stories of this family, when they choose to share it, that will be we'll be able to kind of provide some other sort of data with it. And you're just going to talk about a family that I mentioned that they used to call gypsies, but they weren't. They were Abenaki.
Adaptation was critical to survival. Basket makers were traveling all over Chittenden County. They settled down at the foot of North Prospect, and the city was outraged because they were sitting there selling their baskets. So they quickly made that area into a city park. with hours. So the gypsies could only go there certain hours. When the park closed at dusk, they needed to leave. There was no camping there. They sold their baskets down at the Farrington's trailer park where the cornfields were, where Farrington has cornfields, and he quickly turned that saw it as a money-making deal and turned it into a park for campers to accommodate these gypsies who were coming through. And along at the ferry docks was another area where the gypsies, the Abenaki people, would sell their baskets. And again, they were adapting to changes, adapting to their environmental changing and doing the best they could. They also adapted to materials. The lumber yards that were down there helped them to get some of the materials they need. The dyes that were available down at the lumber yards were used in their baskets as well. And let's go to the next slide. Do you go to Sure. This is two different baskets that shows adaptation. This is a traditional, well, I guess they're all traditional. This is an old basket made with sweetgrass, and sweetgrass is braided. And then later in time, to make the basket go along faster, and when there was a shortage of sweetgrass, they wove in what was called Hong Kong cord. And so the baskets look very similar, the very same techniques, but the materials changed. Also, in the late 1800s, in order to have a uniform basket to make it saleable, they were started using molds to shape their baskets around molds so that they could sell them.
And these are molds, ones made from molds. They're old ones, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's,
And Judy has do you have any on display now? She makes them.
my baskets have a life of their own. Let's go on to the next one. Yes. This one,
This is the Burlington. In case you don't recognize it, an early picture of what the water looked like. I think it's really earlier than the 1920s.
November 12th, 2004. Dad, what did Pepe's father do for work when he moved here? Most of the people worked in the lumberyard at the waterfront. Canada brought down unfinished wood to sell. There was lots of taxes on finished wood, so most everyone from the square, which was what he called Thomas Square, he shortened it, worked making the raw cut wood into lumber at the waterfront. It was a big operation. Some of the people worked at the woolen mills or at Pinkin and Ford Sugar Shop on Pine Street. Some of them were hunters and some made boats. Dad, did anyone from the square make baskets? The only ones I remember making baskets were the Indian clan that lived next door to my grandmother out on the bay when I was a kid. They made baskets and stuff like that. And my father often referred, and many of the people at Moccasin Village referred to families as clans. And I remember looking through my father's yearbook and talking to him about names, specific names in them, and he'd say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so clan. And so he often would put families into clans. No, go ahead.
Okay. The Eugenics Survey has over 6,000 people registered in their so-called pedigrees of degenerate families. Some of these families go back 8 generations, 6, 8 generations, clear back to when Ethan Allen was living in Vermont. And some of them, the ones they really focused on, those were French Indian families. They really worked a little bit harder on them. The other thing is they were trying to show they're all interrelated. That's what they wanted to show. And if they were, that was easy to show if you could talk to neighbors, talk to people and say, oh yeah, he is cousin of so-and-so. So what we did is we put some data, just what this data is, not all the people. These are just addresses where people in the pedigree files of the Eugenics Survey lived in Chittenden County. And each one of those dots, there may be one of those dots that represents one building where families had lived, huge families, maybe with 8 or 10 kids, and a lot of them together for generations. That does not represent population, it is where they are. And our original hope was that we would show a migration pattern out of Burlington, you know, as urban renewal and things like that happen. And eventually we may do that, but for now, does it look like a familiar place? This is where the Eugenics Survey was, and it wasn't just the Eugenics Survey, it was where the Children's Aid, the truant officers were. It was the areas around the Intervale. And there aren't too many, there's a huge family that they were looking at, two that were in the Colchester side also. So, you know, it is definitely that particular situation, or that particular area of French Canadians. And here's a little close-up.
This Sure. Oh, that's right. This large family that Nancy was talking about was my family. When this family was hounded mercilessly, over 43 years period, 623 people, 7 generations, in 2 towns, these people were tracked. The crimes committed by 18 of these people were receiving assistance for food, clothing, rooms at the poorhouse, and procurement of several $6 coffins. Here's the story of one not so distant relative, Lena, a member of this family. And this is quite long, so I'm going to try to tell it.
It's important.
You want me to read it? All right. Lena's mother and father died when she was about 10 years old. Lena only had the opportunity to attend school until the 4th grade. To survive, Lena went to work for different families in Colchester and the Burlington area. When Lena was 18, she found herself with a new baby son, Ernest. Lena knew the father, but he never paid anything towards supporting either Lena or Ernest. Ernest's father's family was from North Avenue, Burlington. Occasionally they would board and clothe Ernest while Lena continued to work. Lena finally got married when she was 23 years old to Joseph. This was a marriage that was blessed by all. Families and friends were happy for Lena, for Joseph came from a good Roman Catholic family, and Lena needed something good in her life. Lena and her new husband and child lived in Winooski over a restaurant. Shortly after the wedding, Lena realized things were not any better. You see, Joseph never supported Ernest or Lena either. Lena went on struggling to support her family for 9 more years. She was always fighting for survival the best she could. Keeping house for others allowed Lena the money to provide for both Ernest and herself. In 1922, Lena fell sick with rheumatic fever and was hospitalized. While in the hospital, Ernest continued to live in the apartment in Winooski with Joseph, but now Joseph was going with a new woman, Catherine. Catherine and her 3 children moved into the tiny apartment and began to keep house for Joseph and her kids. Ernest was just there for lack of a better place to go. Ernest was 13 at this time. With his mother still in the hospital and his stepfather now living with a woman separated from her husband along with several more children, life was confusing at best for Ernest. Lena continued to get better and eventually was able to leave the hospital. An argument ensued as to where Lena would live when she left the hospital, for her spot was now taken up by Catherine and her 3 children. Catherine would not allow Lena into Lena's own home. Recovering from rheumatic fever and still fighting to survive, Lena hired a lawyer, H.A. Bailey. Bailey was considered a hotshot lawyer for the time. His office was in Burlington. During this struggle, Lena had been asking Ernest to quit school and find work to help them. Ernest had already been helping in the restaurant, doing dishes and such for his meals and $4 a week. For a little help with his care came from Catherine and Joseph. The Vermont Children's Aid Society began to enter into Ernest's life. Marked from the beginning, Ernest was labeled as illegitimate by these people. His teacher told the investigator, "The students all like him." Now in 6th grade, he was a good speller and pretty good in arithmetic, reading and writing, but he was bad at English and geography, his teacher continued. So she thought he was subnormal. Off Ernest went for testing with Professor Metcalf, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Vermont. The findings were as follows. He has a rather attractive face and a pleasant manner, but he's dirty and unkept. His cooperation was good. He worked willingly and good-naturedly. Diagnosis, a moron. The psychiatric and neurological examination might be advisable. Ernest was denied the opportunity to leave school and help his mother, something he so badly wanted to do. I thought back to when my son was 13 and chuckled about the dirty and unkept part of this report. This was an area that most mothers can relate to easily, but I was saddened by the diagnosis of moron. This was so unfair. The tests of the time were so subjective, and the reason Ernest most likely had trouble with English was because he spoke French. Ernest obviously had been surviving by working for food and money at 13. I wouldn't consider that subnormal at all. I couldn't think of many 13-year-olds today that could or would do that. The battle continued over obtaining ownership of the home, and Lena had kept before her hospital stay. Her lawyer discovered that Catherine was now paying the rent, for Joseph was still not contributing to support of either Catherine or her children or Lena and Ernest. Because Catherine was paying the rent, Lena had no right to the apartment. Case closed. Lena needed to find another apartment to live. She finds a job at the woolen mill paying $12 a week in an apartment which she paid exactly that in rent for Ernest and her to live. She eventually gets help from the overseer of the poor in Winooski for food and clothing, but it wasn't enough. Within a year, Lena dies. Ernest's name now appears on several lists, that of the Vermont Children's Aid Society, the overseer of the poor in Winooski, and he had been labeled illegitimate and a moron. Denied by his birth father, abandoned and left standing in the road by his stepfather, and now alone without the one person that loved him, what was he to do but survive the best he could, just as his mother had done before him? And he did just that, survival being a lesson you can't learn in school and doesn't show up on an IQ test.
We're going to do a happier thing. And we're almost finished. People have to leave. I know we're going a little longer, so we will not be offended if you get up and have to go. But the Eugenics survey, you can see from this why, if you're not a member of the family and you start talking about these stories, it's really insulting to those who belong to that family. For Judy to talk about her own family, and that's one reason why we don't talk about the names. When a family wants to discuss what happened in the past, then there will be people like us who are more than willing to listen and care.
So
we got into this whole court records. That's what we started looking at court records. It's what happened when the Strong building burned. There were a lot of court records that ended up in special collections, and we thought, well, let's go to the source of the eugenics survey source, and we kept going back further and further. And Judy would bring these court records to her father and read them, and he would fill in the details. It was most enjoyable to learn about.
This particular one, March 11th, 2005. This afternoon I visited my dad and shared a copy of Bygone Burlington, a bicentennial publication about Burlington's 200-year history. I had intended to read parts of the book to Dad and tape his responses. I never intended to read only one paragraph. I opened the book to the 1920s page and read the first paragraph. It said that it was important to mention that bootleggers and bathtub gin existed, but that they were not able to document any stories. Boy, did this get Dad going. How could they have missed it, he said. There were bootleggers at just about every other block. Was there a bootlegger near the square, I asked him. Why, sure, he said. Marie, she had a great business. She ran it for quite a few years. How did that work? Was there a bootlegger on every corner? No, he said. There was one on every few blocks because it was a competitive thing, and you didn't want things too close together. And you wanted to make sure that you knew who was buying from who, so the bootleggers sort of stayed in their neighborhood. And so what we have here is the green dots are stills that my father could identify. And the blue, this was a great field trip. The blue houses were storefronts, and the storefronts sold half pints and pints out the back door. Out the front door, they sold something else. And the runners were kids who brought gallon jugs to to clients on Church Street and places like that. And what they would do is they would put the gallon jugs in brown paper bags, attach them to the back of the kids' bikes, and they'd pedal down to the clients. But
Recycled. Good thing.
yeah, and there was this whole underground economy going on because the kids got paid a penny for a half pint and 2 pennies for a pint container. And so they would go back and collect the containers and bring them back to the stills. So that the canning jars kept getting recycled. So there was this whole underground thing that was happening. And we know there's a lot more than this, but some of these we were able to connect with court records, and so we found out. He would show us the house, and we'd go find out who the people were. We'd go to the court records, and we'd find that great story about them.
And then from there you can go to the newspaper. It's easier when you get a date to go up to the microfilm and read all the clippings. So with all these pieces together, you get quite a story of this period.
So,
let me go on.
yeah.
Okay. So then, okay, there's one.
This just shows you what the land looked. This is in 1942. This is St. Louis Street. And you can see, like, you would drop off, that's the Intervale in the background, and that was one of the little green dots on the map. And this one is an important block. This block showed up in many, many records. And now, today, that Grand Union isn't there. It's a vacant lot. But I don't know, it showed up as a storefront, it showed up in court records. They kept picking up people. There was a restaurant there, and the court records would show they pick up people there that were staggering and all kinds of problems. So it was pretty easy to figure out where that was. And then next slide. Well, yeah, let's do, you want to do this?
Well, no, do this one.
Okay, this is, I'm sorry I'm rushing here, March 11th. We had been working on the map that placed the stills, runners, and storefronts, and I recalled this story. Dad told me that Pepe used to work for F.S. Lanou doing plumbing, and they got this job to refit this old tenement house on North Avenue. I remember Perkins' letter to the editor asking landlords to fix up or tear down these old places, so the story seemed to fit. Dad continued this story. It seemed that Pepe was hired to put a bathtub, toilet, and sink into every apartment in this building. The contract stated that he was to return 1 month later to check and repair any leaks. When he returned, he first noticed the bait for sale signs posted on most of the windows. Thinking nothing of it, he proceeded to check each apartment for leaks. Pepe quickly noticed that every bathtub was filled with not only water, but minnows and other bait. It appeared that the people in this house had done without a bathtub for so long, it seemed the only appropriate thing to do with it was to make a little money. Adapting as their ancestors had always done, they used the tub to store their minnows, sell bait, and add to their cash flow.
In case you don't know, that's cigar stores were Pilates.
Yeah.
And now it's Burlington College on North Avenue.
That is funny. Looking like
This picture, this shows an old picture of the mills, but you can also see that the road, which was called Winooski Road then, but it's lower road, and the ropes went over across the way, and we have stories to go with these pictures too, but we're looking at the time. I think we can always come back to this, and we want to move it forward here.
I know, just let's go to midnight. This is good.
We'll come back to that one. Judy has lots of stories. The Eugenics survey ended in 1936, at least they did, and the state took over any other eugenics kinds of activities that were going to go on in terms of deciding who should be parents or not. But in 1938, and around that period, they started a big movement to tear down all those slums and all those tenement houses. This tenement here is one of the places that the Children's Aid and the Eugenics Survey and all these people were very interested in. And we'll show you what it looks like today. A lot of families lived here, with French Canadian families, or French or Abenaki families, I guess. And Perkins was going to weigh in on how we ought to tear down these. He says, you know, that he had this little pin map. Do you have a pin map? Mm-hmm. Perkins had one in the Eugenics Survey office, and he said, you know, their students in his eugenics class had gone down to Week School, which was the Vermont Industrial School before that, and interviewed all the kids and found out where they lived and collected a lot of data. And they had a little pin map showing where they lived. And he writes in this article, he says, I'm an ardent disciple of the doctrine of heredity, but I cannot shut my eyes to the environment. Whether you plant good seed or bad or both, you must expect poor crops if the soil and the climate are poor. Now this is a eugenicist talk. By the same token, raise a child in a substandard home. Surround him or her with vicious-minded playmates. And frequently you get an adult who is a charge on the town, a drunken loafer, or a criminal for your pains. And this was his attitude towards people living here. And he wasn't alone. We had a big constituency, unfortunately. Burlington has frequently been blinded by immediate quick returns on her investments. She has lost many of her wonderful residential areas through blindness and greed. What became of our Lakeshore Drive, our Intervale Parkway? Our forebears did that to us. What are we doing to our successors? Something worse. If we let slip a chance to give the dwellers in those slum spots of our Queen City a chance to at least vacate the wretched excuses for abodes that some of us, as bad luck would have it, find ourselves to be owning or controlling. We can ill afford to lose the rent, but in the name of everything that's decent, moral, and surely in the future profitable to our successors, let us think of the next generation. So he was going to tear this down and give him an excuse to get out and go somewhere else. I think some people call this, but were you going to read one of this?
Wait.
Okay, so Judy, she just went through the roof.
I went through the
little. I used to tell her, write to Mr. Perkins, write to Ellen Anderson, write a letter and tell him what the way it really was.
I'm not really crazy. I don't always write to dead people, but in this journal I wrote to dead people often. So March 3rd, 2005. Dear Mr. Perkins, Mr. Perkins, I too have created a pin chart. I too have noticed that the definite addresses are in one area. This area happens to surround the most scenic views of Burlington. The pins are clearly absent from the hill. This is not coincidental, as you know. The original people of Burlington used the river, the lake, and the Intervale for hunting, fishing, and gathering to survive, and it was a natural thing to settle in these areas. It appears to be quite difficult for you to see something so beautiful and not be in the possession of the elite from the hill of Burlington. These people are the descendants of the original inhabitants. Their way of life may not be the same as yours. Their ethics, morals, values are obviously different than yours, but they are surviving in a changing world that they have no control over. They are surviving a forced change to the best of their ability, just as they have survived from the beginning of creation. Must you teach your students to condemn these people for surviving? Would it not be better to teach your students to understand this adaptation process and accept any differences they may see? Or is this something the elite of Burlington are not willing to either see or accept? You also asked, quote, what became of our Lakeshore Drive, our Intervale Parkway? Please allow me to explain. You see, Mr. Perkins, you and other well-meaning people created a society of people that hid from the suffocation of good doers. They hid from the courts, the police, the truant officers, the social workers, the Mothers Club, and every other person of authority you could throw at them. Why? Because your way of life was not for them. To these people, family, community, and land were more valuable than possessions, prestige, and money. Mr. Perkins, I find it difficult to understand your anger about what has become of, quote, your Lakeshore Drive and your Intervale Parkway. Are you suffering from cultural amnesia? Do you not recall that Lakeshore Drive and Intervale Parkway belonged to the Winooski first, and consequently their descendants who currently occupy these streets? This land is in Dakina, not the Queen City, as you state in your article. Why is it that land seems to be the root of all evil in Burlington? It's always the land. Why? Why must the land always be someone's personal possession? In your letter, you also state, what are we doing to our successors? Mr. Perkins, it's important to the survival of the people that your students have pinned up on the map, that you understand this question. Please dig deep into your heart and search for the answer. Sincerely, Judy Dow.
Well, as we all know, urban renewal did come. That building is that one you saw before. It's been renovated. It's still a part of the building. And what happened to Frenchtown and Little Italy, which were down there, they're now those people were encouraged to leave through eminent domain. Their property was taken away. And we have another whole series of research on the fires that were set that Judy's father knows about because he was in the fire department. And so what happens, we were looking down here, we were on one of our field trips, and I said, oh, this is interesting. The Northgate residents, they rebuilt new homes for them, new apartments for them, and really removed that community. And they can only use that crossing for the beach and bike access only because the well-to-do have built up along there. There are some pretty nice condos there now, and the people who used to live down there were put in Northgate apartments, and they have to use the servants' entrance or whatever. Anyhow, we do have a lot on urban renewal that we're not going to present tonight, but you can go see a very nice exhibit at the Fleming Museum that's all about Burlington and Winooski changes over time, and I'll leave this up tonight. Okay. I wonder, will this land, this looks like the last stand of people from the old neighborhoods, which is down by the mouth of the river. I'm wondering, will this land remain in the hands of the families who have lived here for generations? In the past few years, developers have been lusting after this land, and that this community has called home. And Burlington's owners and listers seem to view their land as a piece of lucrative real estate, taxing them out of their homes. For these families, the community is their common tot, as it was for their ancestors. For me, this is no longer a landscape anymore. It's a place of deep history and special memories. As I understand more clearly the ways in which the Abenaki history is interwoven with the history of my people. In November of 2004, I wrote, once again, I'm on the path of the eugenics past. As Judy and I map out the currently invisible pathways of understanding and of misunderstandings, of long-hidden relationships, conflicts, and experiences, perhaps we will illuminate the dark corners of our collective past and realize my dream of a complete, inclusive, and truthful history of this land and all its people. History changes the present through enlarging our understanding of the past, as historians often say. I believe in the past 2 years, we have made a true beginning.
I'm happy that I've had the opportunity to present here tonight. My hopes are that people see that I was in a safe environment to tell my story, that people have embraced these stories, and finally that the lost birds will somehow find a way to tell their story too. Each one of us has a piece of the puzzle. If people can feel safe in telling their story, hopefully we can take each piece of the puzzle, put them together, and complete the story of the Abenaki history. Thank you.